It's finally time to take a look back at Shadow Raiders, the third television show by Mainframe Entertainment, the animation studio behind ReBoot and Beast Wars. This one's gonna be a bit different than usual since it's my first time reviewing a 20-year-old cartoon series that I did not watch as a kid. But a lot of you guys did, and it fits perfectly with this retrospective series, so of course I had to give it a watch. All I'd been told going into Shadow Raiders was that it possessed many of the hallmarks of Mainframe Entertainment's other work. Nuanced, well-developed characters with a mature, engaging story, and the honor of having been prematurely cancelled on a big cliffhanger ending. After watching Shadow Raiders from beginning to end, I can confirm that this is indeed a terrific show and an underappreciated gem that I really wish I'd had the chance to check out when I was a kid. I liked Shadow Raiders a lot, but despite that, I do totally understand why it was cancelled. I'm getting a bit ahead of myself though. Let's start at the beginning, shall we? The year was 1998, and Mainframe Entertainment's first two television shows were both massively successful, with Beast Wars additionally proving that the studio's then cutting-edge CGI, combined with a sharp, well-written science fiction story, was a winning formula for selling merchandise to a young audience. Enter the toy company Trendmasters, looking to create a television adaptation of their product line, War Planets.
War Planets, a universe at your command.
Unlike with Hasbro and Beast Wars before it, Trendmasters gave Mainframe creative control over the project. Brendan McCarthy returned to design characters as he did on ReBoot, with two of ReBoot and Mainframe's co-creators Ian Pearson and Phil Mitchell in key positions on the show's production, along with many of the same writers and directors from ReBoot and Beast Wars. Yes, a lot of the right ingredients were in place for War Planets to be a big hit. But wait a second, is the show called War Planets or Shadow Raiders? Because I've gotten comments on other videos calling it both. IMDb lists the show as War Planets, while Wikipedia lists it as Shadow Raiders. The opening credits, meanwhile, have both names in its title card. It's a bit obtuse and there's not a lot of information out there, but near as I can figure, the original Trendmasters toy line was called War Planets, while the subtitle Shadow Raiders was created for the television show by Mainframe Entertainment and given more emphasis in the title card after prior experience with Beast Wars' title being censored in their home country of Canada for use of the word war. Thus, the complete title of the show is War Planets Shadow Raiders, but it was only ever referred to as simply Shadow Raiders in Canadian promotional material.
Shadow Raiders, tonight at 7 on YTV.
This show has a very unique premise. There are these 4 planets from a solar system called the Cluster that have warred with one another for as long as any of them can remember.
The 4 planets in our cluster have been at war, stealing one another's resources. As a courier of planet Rock, I raided planets Ice, Bone, and Fire, just as they raided us.
The wars between these 4 worlds have always been fought over each planet's unique resources, since no single one of them can survive without supplies from the other 3. Planet Ice is frozen, but abundant in water. Planet Fire resembles a giant volcano and produces heat energy. Planet Bone is swampy, teeming with organic life that can be used for food, and Planet Rock is, of course, rocky, containing ample amounts of minerals. At first I thought it was silly that none of these species evolving independently of one another on their respective planets were capable of sustaining their own lives without interplanetary supply exchange. But this aspect of the show is clearly an allegory for our various nations' inability to share our own resources effectively in real life. And besides, it's heavily hinted in Shadow Raiders' second season that the war planets of the cluster and many other worlds beyond it are actually artificial, so I was able to look past it.
Controls for some sort of machine.
This status quo is interrupted in the pilot episode when the system is invaded by heralds of the Beast Planet, an enormous being that travels the universe eating other planets it encounters. The cluster's planets must put aside their differences and ally together if they're ever to survive this common threat, with the show chronicling the efforts of several key individuals from each culture as they attempt to do so. The universe of Shadow Raiders is mysterious, and it feels lived in. In this way, I'd describe Shadow Raiders as like a version of Battlestar Galactica for kids, except instead of Cylons, they're running away from Unicron or Galactus. This recipe has a dash of Star Wars and Star Trek thrown in and is mixed in the same bowl as ReBoot and Beast Wars. Really fun stuff.
Stay frosty.
Underneath the super out there science fiction plotline is a simple but effective story about the power of friendship and the results of teamwork being greater than the sum of its parts. It's a very well written show that doesn't talk down to its young audience. Shadow Raiders is atmospheric, often tense and exciting, but can turn on a dime to become somber and reflective, or even tragic. In particular, the episodes Ragnarok Parts 1 and 2, This Is the Way the World Ends, Sandstorm, Time Bomb, and Death of a King were all superbly written and stand up there as solid science fiction screenplays in and of themselves. This is all anchored by a cast of interesting and well-developed characters. Shadow Raiders' protagonist is Graveheart, played by Paul Dobson, fresh off of voicing the grown-up Enzo on ReBoot's 3rd season.
Call me Matrix.
Graveheart is your tried and true, unlikely hero archetype. A miner from planet Rock who gets swept up into interplanetary politics mostly by virtue of the fact that he was one of the only survivors of the first battle with the Beast. A humble man of few words, Graveheart took a few episodes for me to warm up to, but I think this was by design, as the character is going through a journey of self-discovery throughout the first season. He begins the series without much self-worth, thinking of himself as just a miner, and he never passes up an opportunity to remind the audience of that fact either.
I'm just a miner. I'm just a miner. Graveheart. Miner. Granite class. My dad was a miner. I'm just a miner. Just a miner. As was his father before him.
A thief, you mean?
No, a miner. As a miner, I'm just a miner. And his before him. I've always been a miner. What do you mean I can't come in?
Sorry, we don't serve miners here.
You gotta be kidding. There's no guardian here. I'm just a miner.
However, as he becomes more and more involved as a leading member of the Interplanetary Alliance, he gradually accepts this new role and learns to see himself as the person that his friends already know he is. By the end of Season 1, Graveheart has fully come into his own, and I was definitely rooting for him.
I never really much thought of myself as a fighting man. But apparently, I was just a miner.
Joining Graveheart is Princess Tekla, the last survivor of planet Tek, a world from another solar system whose destruction at the hands of the Beast planet Tekla narrowly escapes at the beginning of Shadow Raiders' pilot episode. It's Tekla who first warns the cluster about the impending threat of the Beast and recruits Graveheart in her mission to unite the people of the war planets against it.
Not this world. They won't take this world too.
She's kind of like robot Princess Leia.
Will somebody get this big walking carpet out of my way?
Rounding out the rest of Shadow Raiders' main characters are the sovereigns of the planets and their close friends or advisors. Each of them is distinct, with their own motivations driving their actions within the Alliance and outside of it. Cryos, the king of planet Ice, is the most level-headed of these rulers and is present with Graveheart and Tekla in the pilot episode, so he, his impulsive daughter Princess Zera, and planet Ice make up the first worlds to seek out an alliance. Cryos is a straightforward character. He immediately devotes himself to the Alliance as soon as the idea comes up, and is essentially the person responsible for putting Graveheart in charge of the Alliance by lending him legitimacy and support in the beginning. Next to join are Planet Fire's eager young prince Pyrus and his distrustful Grand Vizier named Vizier.
Vizier! Vizier, please!
These two both want nothing more than to protect their people and their homeland, but differ fiercely over what that means the right course of action should be. The Vizier starts out Shadow Raiders as a fairly one-note character, but ends up getting some of the best lines in the series.
I spit my last breath at thee!
I spit my last breath at thee.
Prince Pyrus is rash but good-natured, and his arc sees him struggle with what it means to be a good leader to his people. This is in stark contrast to the cowardly, lecherous, hedonistic, self-serving Emperor Femur of Planet Bone and his treacherous advisor Pelvus, played by Scott McNeil, who sounds to me like McNeil doing a riff on David Kay's Megatron from Beast Wars.
Yes, a difficult job at best, your obliqueness.
The duo is a lot of fun to watch, and they play off each other spectacularly, reuniting McNeil with Garry Chalk as Femur. These two previously played Hack and Slash together on ReBoot.
You rang? Your hugeness?
All ready and waiting, O evil one.
Pelvus, and Planet Bone in general, have little love for Femur, who is the victim of frequent assassination attempts and various other attempted coups. It's mostly played for comic relief, though. Assassinating and usurping the former leader is apparently the most common form of succession on Planet Bone.
Yeah, I know, that's how it works. You snag the throne, you rule on Bone. The guy that dies is food for fly.
Femur is a particularly fascinating character to me in that there's essentially nothing likable or redeemable about him whatsoever. He sees most other people as little more than means to an end, and turns on his allies at the drop of a hat if he suspects he can get a better deal from some other party. He really is a pretty despicable guy. You wouldn't have to change much about Femur's character, and he would seem right at home as the villain of a lesser kids show. But despite this, he spends a large percentage of Shadow Raiders as one of its protagonists, and is genuinely fun to watch most of the time, if not a bit cringe-inducing.
Think you and me can make a deal in private, Toots?
Femur's, womanizing would not fly at all nowadays, especially on a kids show.
How'd you get on my ship? Not that I'd exactly mind giving you a ride, if you catch my drift.
For kids.
He starts to develop something resembling the beginnings of a redemption arc towards the end of Season 2, but it never comes to fruition. Finally, there's Mantle, the Lord of Rock, and his captain of the guard, Jade. While Mantle himself is a secondary character, only appearing in a few scattered episodes, Jade is one of the more interesting characters in the series.
On the house. Just leave the house standing, please.
No promises.
Initially hostile in most situations, Jade is fiercely loyal to a fault, which actually becomes a pretty big source of conflict for her down the line. She serves as Mantle's unofficial representative in the Alliance, but also has a pre-existing history with Graveheart, and creates friendships among the other members of the Alliance, giving her conflicted loyalties when the visions of these two parties eventually diverge.
Felt good to hit something.
Indeed.
This ongoing plotline is very abruptly resolved in the final episode of the series, but like Femur's redemption arc, feels more to me like something being set up to play a part in a potential third season had the show not been cancelled.
This can't be the end.
As for villains, apart from the Beast Planet itself and the waves upon waves of beast drones that it produces, there are 3 heralds of the beast called Lamprey, Blokk, and Void, who periodically show up to put a face to the efforts of the bad guys. Blokk is a sort of military leader who usually takes the role of commanding beast drones in direct assaults. He's voiced by Scott McNeil, doing what sounds like an Arnold Schwarzenegger impression at times.
I'll be back.
I swear, Scott McNeil just didn't get enough work in the 90s. Lamprey, on the other hand, is more of a behind-the-scenes manipulator, often attempting to turn Alliance members against each other in some way. Void doesn't speak, and unfortunately we never really find out what his deal is, but it's vaguely alluded to that he more directly represents the interests of the Beast Planet than Blokk or Lamprey do.
I don't think Void is particularly happy with this.
And that he punishes the other two on behalf of the Beast when they fail. I sometimes wished that these heralds didn't exist in the show, since I think that the Beast Planet is more intimidating on its own as a big, mysterious, ruthless force of nature than it is with these often comical mini-bosses hovering around it. Every time I found myself on that train of thought, though, I reminded myself that I was watching a show ostensibly for children, where you kind of need to have a more tangible bad guy. The target audience of the show was actually something I had to remind myself of, in case you couldn't tell, throughout a lot of Shadow Raiders, especially near the beginning of the series, where you get a ton of scenes of the planet's monarchs just sort of hanging around with each other, and even going on missions together without bodyguards or any sort of protection, despite the generations of warfare between their peoples that immediately preceded the start of the show.
Divided by ignorance and hatred, they have no time for compromise or peace.
So me and Tibia blew up the bar, then skedaddled back to her place. And then there was...
This happens a lot less in the second season, though, where most communication between them is limited to video chat. I also noticed that some scenes feel a bit empty, since each of the 4 planets only really gets 2 characters to work with, presumably for the same reason that Beast Wars had a cap on the total number of characters. Budgetary constraints. Again though, Shadow Raiders' second season rectifies this problem a lot, with the inclusion of some new faces, single episode guest stars, and a wider use of extras modeled off of the main character's assets. Speaking of assets, one thing about Shadow Raiders I was concerned about going in was whether or not I would enjoy the animation, since unlike with ReBoot or Beast Wars, I have no nostalgia for this show, and the dated visuals on those other 2 have proved to be a barrier for people who didn't grow up with them. I am, however, happy to say that I was not put off by Shadow Raiders animation. In fact, I took note of this show's animation, and how its animation budget budget seemed to be spread around far more evenly than Beast Wars, which focused heavily on detailed character models to the detriment of most everything else. In contrast, Shadow Raiders animators have put a great deal of thought into many aspects of the show's world, such as unique environments, architecture, weapons, clothing, and even several different types of spaceships for each planet. They also did a really great job, for the time anyway, at animating fire, which I understand is fairly difficult to do. Planet Rock reminds me of the place where every fight in Dragon Ball Z took place, with its randomly jutting out towers and plateaus of brown rock. I did find some of the characters a tad over-designed, particularly the Beast characters, which seem like they'd be a heck of a lot cooler looking in 2 dimensions than they are here in 3, but I don't think that's a problem with the animation per se. Once again, improvements are made in Season 2 where some of the new assets begin to take on that more polished, smooth, cel-shaded look that would largely characterize Beast Machine's art direction later that year. Shadow Raiders only improves as it progresses, and I would really have loved to see a 3rd season. So now we come to the heart of the matter. If the show was really as great as I've been describing, why did it get cancelled? Well, despite receiving decent television ratings, Shadow Raiders' success was unfortunately not being reflected in War Planet's toy sales, which never really took off. It didn't help either that the adaptation of War Planets ended up being named something completely different. I mean, this is just basic marketing, folks. The product line needs to have one name. 2 names is just confusing. The intellectual property owner, Trendmasters, looked at the numbers and decided to pull the plug on Shadow Raiders after 2 seasons. However, as I indicated earlier, this doesn't seem like much of a stretch from where I'm sitting. The War Planet's toys really had very little to do with the Shadow Raiders television show. None of the characters from the show were anywhere to be seen in the first wave of toys, while the planets themselves, which were the entire focus of the toy line, only have roles to play in the show's action on a few occasions. Additionally, only 5 of the 10 War Planets from the toy line are featured prominently in the show, with the remaining 5 kind of treated like Easter eggs. You know, though, I really don't think that this lack of cohesion between the toys and the show was really anybody's fault. This base constructing micro machine sort of thing with planets and moons doesn't translate well into a television show which needs to have a narrative centered around a core cast of characters. Later on, toys based on characters from the Shadow Raiders television show did eventually come out, but in my opinion, they and the Planet toys that came before look like they're aiming for a bit of a younger demographic than what the show was likely to garner as a fan base, with its often dark tone and introspective writing.
Wars are filled with difficult choices. Only the strongest will stand by their decisions and accept the responsibility.
Weapons smashing, planets blessing.
Exactly.
So could the creators of the Shadow Raiders cartoon have dumbed down their concept to be more easily digestible for a younger, toy-buying demographic? And could they have been just a little more shameless when plugging said toys in the show? I mean, sure, they could have, yeah. The War Planet's toy line may have even stood a slightly higher chance at hitting the sales required for Trendmasters to give Shadow Raiders that 3rd season. But that'd be sort of like selling your hair for money to buy a comb. You'd be sacrificing the very things that make it special enough of a show in retrospect to warrant making this video about it in the first place. I, for one, am glad, and I think it's safe to say that most people who grew up watching the show are also glad that that didn't happen. I've seen a lot of people in the comments talk about Shadow Raiders ending on a big cliffhanger, but I really didn't find it that hard to deal with. The series concludes on a high and positive note, leaving open the possibility of a continuation, one that was never going to happen, but at least the ending isn't on such a dire note that it needs a continuation to properly conclude the story. My biggest regret with the cliffhanger is actually that we never got more time to spend with Jewelia and Sternum, 2 characters who are introduced in the final episodes of the series, seemingly positioned to join the main cast from that point on. I'm not going to talk much about them, since to do so would go into specific plot points that I don't want to talk about, but suffice it to say they're both very well written, and it's a crying shame that they never got a full season to stretch their legs. If anyone wants to talk about them, we can chat in the comments section. You may have noticed that I've been largely avoiding spoilers for the majority of this video. I made that choice because from what I can gather, Shadow Raiders doesn't seem to have nearly as big of a cult following as the other shows I've talked about so far on this Mainframe Entertainment retrospective, and I would highly encourage anyone still with me at this point who hasn't actually seen Shadow Raiders to go check it out, especially if you have fond memories of ReBoot or Beast Wars. The DVD sets have been out of print for some time now, and Trendmasters has been out of business for years, so I can safely say that you won't be hurting the sales of any official distributor if you decide to seek the show out through alternative means. I mean, heck, the whole series has been available to watch on YouTube on multiple accounts, seemingly uncontested for years, so it's super easy to find if you're looking for it. Shadow Raiders may have been cut short, but as they say, the flame that burns twice as bright also burns half as long. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to hit that like button, subscribe if you're new for more like it in the future, and leave a comment down below letting me know your thoughts on Shadow Raiders. The next retrospective video will be Beast Wars Season 3, but until then, I've got lots of other videos on this channel you can check out if you'd like to do so. Thanks very much once again, all of you, for watching, and take care.